So let's go over and grab a couple of questions here, grab one and see what we've got. This first one's from Dale Jones, and he says, would you ever talk about pivot points from the front view and shot shapes on one of your YouTube videos? I will assume hook will pivot before a straight shot and more forward for a fade. Okay, well, all right, let's talk about those pivot points from this face-on angle. First of all, when you start talking about hook and fade, you can control or create hooks and fades either with the face position or with the path. So there's two ways to make the ball curve. Now when we talk about these pivot points, when you go back on the backswing, when you start down, actually the club, it starts to pivot right here off your right shoulder. I mean, here's where the pivot starts, because the handle's starting to come down and the heel of the club is starting to work out. So it doesn't really wait. It starts right here from the top. Now, if you watch what I'm doing here from that angle, what you should notice is even though the handle's coming down and the club head's going out, okay, there is no unhinging of my wrists. That's a big misunderstanding. That's why this angle's good. So when I get to the top of my swing, the weight of this club head is to the left of my hands. So when I start down, because of the weight of that club head and the handle coming down, this angle sometimes actually even increases a little bit, but at the same time, you're working the club, what feels to be, back out in front of you. Now, it's never going to get vertical. It won't do that, because the weight of the club is trying to make you go this way. You're offsetting it by feeling it's this way. That's going to put it right in the middle, and it creates a rotational torque in your shoulder that when you let the momentum go, it'll unwind your arm. So the pivot happens right up here. I mean, Nicklaus talked about releasing the club from the top. You know, Joe Nicklaus said stand the club up. Well, you don't wait until you get down here and then go, or wait until you get here and try to stand the club up. It starts right here, right off your right shoulder the minute you start down. But the key here is that when you do it, it's not about unhinging your wrists. Then the momentum of the club runs the club into the ball, straightens your arms out, and then the momentum of the club rehinges your wrists up until you have this angle back up over this point down here. So if I do it nice and slow, you can see how those pivot points work. So it's a nice smooth motion, and we're dealing with the momentum and the weight of the club. Now when you practice, you want to practice in slow speeds. You want just enough speed where you can feel the momentum of the club, so you can start to feel how to start it down, let the weight of the club go, and then rehinge your wrists up on the follow through. It has nothing to do with unhinging my wrists. That's something that's going to happen because the momentum of the club does it for you. But that pivot point starts right there, right here. And it's done with the rotation of my arm and the moving the heel of the club out. It's not done with your right arm or your right shoulder. It's not out this way. That's why a lot of you get into pulling the shot. So if I showed you that from this angle, you get to the top, the handle starts down, the heel of the club works out. My shoulders aren't what's doing it in my right arm. So if I showed you from here, here's where a lot of people go. They try to tip the club out as they start down with their right shoulder and their right arm. So it gets the club out too far and the face shut, and then they start hitting pulls. So you're not doing this with your right forearm or your right elbow and your right shoulder. It's just really, it's this move right here. So if I turn around this way, it's a real simple move. I'm here. So what's my right shoulder doing? It certainly isn't moving out. What's my right elbow doing? It's coming down. It isn't moving out. You don't turn the face down this way or work the club out in front of you this way. It works out in front of you right here. My arms are coming down because there's space here, and the club head's working out. Then once the club gets down here in front of me, then everything turns through the ball together. You run the club into the ball, and then my arms straighten out, and then if my arms are relaxed, as the weight of the club head goes past, it then rehinges back up and you hit this third pivot point. So it's a nice smooth motion. Starts here, the weight of the club runs into the ball, straightens your arms and rehinges your wrist back up on the follow through. It's a pretty simple motion. If you do it slow and you get a feel for the momentum of the club, you're going to find with very little effort, it's going to get a lot of good results. The next question is kind of related. It's Russell Gilbrook, and he says, I was at the driving range practicing your theory when a local pro came over and asked me why I was doing your downswing movement. I told him, and he said I needed to get my elbow into my side quickly, as this is what creates lag. I thought as soon as I started the butt end of the club down, the elbow automatically joins the right side. Okay, so now we're getting back into this lag concept again. So, the right elbow into the right side. All right, if we've got the club at the top, and you're gonna bring the handle's gonna come down and the club head's gonna work out. If this is the task, where's my right elbow going? Well, it's going down, not because I'm forcing my right elbow down. If you start trying to force your right elbow down, which I did that for a long time, if you get up here and you force your right elbow down, what's going to tend to happen to the club? See, if I force my right elbow down, now, if I'm up here and the handle comes down, and my arms come down like this, my elbow goes into my side, but the club doesn't fall behind my hands. So, that's one of the most important things and one of the misunderstood parts of lag. Yeah, I'm going to have lag. I get up here, I start down, and because the handle's coming down and the club head's going out, and I'm not unhinging my wrist, so because the weight of the club is to this side of my hands, as I start down, it's the weight of the club's maintaining the angle in my wrist. And because I'm directing the momentum into the correct arc, all of a sudden, I can have a lot of lag. I don't have to think about it. And what's going to happen is because the weight of that club is directed into the right arc, and if you notice where my hands are, they're not going at the ball. Now, when all of a sudden, when the weight of the club goes, it runs into the ball. So my right elbow comes into my side, not because I'm pulling it into my side, because the handle of the club comes down and the heel of the club goes out. That's going to create the lag you want and the release pattern that you want. The momentum of the club does it for you. This is from Eduardo Vilas. He says, great channel. He says, my rear end tends to move off the line on my backswing. That's pretty typical, Eduardo. Let me show you why that happens. So we get set up and we're talking about your rear end here. Well, a lot of people, they think that this hip is supposed to stay still. So your brain says, keep my right hip still, keep my right knee in. So as you start back, as you start to rotate, this hip is staying still. So what happens? Well, this left hip has to turn. Your hips are going to turn. So now this line, all of a sudden, I'm pulling off this line. And most of the time when you try to keep this still, what happens is you get here and you'll also, because you're trying to turn, you'll lift up out of your spine angle. So if you lift up, okay, what's going to happen? All right, so what you're trying to do with this hip, however much your hips rotate back and forth, whatever amount this hip is going to turn this way, this one has to offset it. Because we're talking about the center of your pelvis not moving closer to the ball. So if you've got two sides to that and it starts to twist, if this one doesn't turn, so if all of a sudden this hip doesn't move back and this one moves this way, what's my center doing? It's moving closer to the ball. Now you're in trouble. So when I start back, my right hip moves back, and it's moving back relative to my center as much as my left hip's moving here. That's what keeps me centered. You know, if you watch most players, when they go back, their right hip settles, it moves back. So don't try to keep your right hip still, and don't necessarily try to keep your right knee flexed, because that locks your hip, and then we're into all this kind of stuff. So if I set up to the ball, if you watch my right hip, as I start back, my right hip turns, it moves back, and then it starts down into the ball from there. So it moves back and it stays back. It moves back and it stays back. It's actually pushing away from the club. It's pushing away. It's pushing away from the club. So it turns back and it pushes away. Turns back and pushes away. Then you create space. So hopefully that helps you a lot more with what you're trying to do with your swing and explains the lifting out of the spine angle. All right, here's the next one. This is from Ted Douglas. How do you properly pivot the body? Okay, this becomes a very interesting concept. We're gonna talk a lot about this in the future because there's a lot of things out there that, again, are based on what somebody sees and they think that's happening. How your body pivots and how it moves relative to a golf club is pretty instinctive if you understand what it is you're trying to do. So, if any one of you went out and took a rope and you put a weight out on the end of the ropes and you started swinging the rope around you like this, so you're swinging it around you. Okay, it's the same as if you were doing a hula hoop. So if I've got this weight going around me and I want to stay centered so I don't fall down, as that weight comes around me right here, I have to push away from it. Now you're constantly pushing away from that weight. So when somebody starts to tell me, how do I make my body rotate? How do I turn my hips? I'm not sure I understand that question because they're going to do it automatically. If you utilize forces correctly, your hips will rotate. If you're forcing your hips to rotate, something's wrong with what you're doing. Or let's put it this way. You're creating forces you don't need to. So if you think about, we've got this weight going around you. And if you watch my body, or if you went out and you just started swinging something, what would happen is every time you swung it around you, your body would push away from that momentum. It'd just push away. Now, if I keep pushing away from it, all of a sudden my body will just rotate. So I set up here, the club goes back. All I'm doing is I'm allowing my body to rotate into and put pressure into the ground. I'm not trying to shift weight. See, that'll kill you. If you're trying to shift weight, it'll get in the way of what you call pivot. Because if my brain thinks shift weight and you're trying to turn, see, that won't work. So how people fix that is they try to kick their knee in, stand on a ball. Well, now you're so locked in your hip, you can't, now you're like this. I'm going, well, how are you going to play from there? Okay, so this hip has to rotate. So what you're trying to do is as the club swings back, you're putting force into the ground. You're putting force into the ground. Now, if you put force into the ground here, and then you're going to put force into the ground over there, your body, along with offsetting that momentum, will pivot on its own. So I set up here, I make a backswing, I'm allowing myself to rotate into or put pressure into that foot. When I start down, as that club's coming down and it's coming around, it's just like this swinging around me. I'm actually pushing away from it, away from it. And as it's coming down and I'm pushing away from the momentum's going around me. So as I'm pushing away from it, what happens? My body rotates and it makes the swing stay in sequence. Very interesting concept. Everybody's trying to figure out how to time their body with their hands and arms. Well, if you jump out ahead of it and try to force your hips to turn, it's hard to catch it up consistently. If you know how to utilize momentum, it's not hard to stay in sync with what's going around you. You already know how to do it. It's not something you have to relearn. It's something you already know, you didn't relate it to golf. Hopefully these answers have helped and cleared some questions up. More importantly, whatever your questions are, send them. Look at the videos. If you have a question, send it to us so we can take a look, find what people aren't understanding so we can help you get better. That's my whole goal here, is to help you play better golf.